All right, go ahead and set up your MLA information. Today's the 16th. Glazing ceramics is our title. Once you have your MLA information, go ahead and type MLA into the chat. I'm going to set a timer for this just so we can move things along smoothly. So recording our MLA information and typing MLA in the chat once you have written that down in your notebook. Let's take another minute to get that down. And again, confirming today and every day that we have a lecture, it really helps when you guys are all typing into the chat. That way I'm not lagging in any way and I can be consistent and have a good flow. Also, we have a synchronous work session at the end of our lecture. So I just want to make sure that you guys have more time than less time. So keep it up in the chat. I want to hear from everyone. Waiting for 7 more people to type MLA in the chat. 5 more people. Okay, little alarming. Little pun there. So glazing ceramics, there are so many options, it could be overwhelming. And what artists do is they make these test tiles. This is something that I've been doing over the last 4 years since I took over the ceramics program. And they use texture to not only see how the results can vary, but they change up the recipe a little bit. Notice down on the 3rd row on the right, you can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 variations of green, and it kind of fades into like a blue green as well. They also have on the top row variations of white and off white, just to see what it's going to look like on a piece before actually applying it to a finished product. Then once it's been applied, we have kind of a matte, chalky look. And then I load it into the kiln and fire it for the final firing, also known as stage 6 glazeware. I put the temperature on that firing to 2300 degrees, and I also fire it a little bit faster than the bisqueware kiln. And that allows the glaze to reach a higher temperature, flux, and turn to a glass-like surface. And upon cooling, we get a finished product. So for project number 1, I'm going to give you 3 options to choose from for your pinch pot. These are all food safe glazes, and the reason why I've chosen cobalt, black, and clear for the pinch pot is because they have really good smoothing properties. So if you do have any rough areas, or maybe your coil foot detached slightly and there's a crack there, these glazes will fill in cracks, smooth anything rough, and also they have the highest amount of shine out of any colors that I have in the studio. Say you want to make a spinach and artichoke dip in the oven for a baseball game you're watching on TV on Sunday. You can put any of these pinch pots into the oven up to 450 degrees or microwave them, because I have incorporated some ingredients that allow them to heat up at a high temperature and be food safe. So I want you to be thinking about what would look best on your form. And this is the timeline. I'm going to give you the Google form, have you select the color. Once I review that on Friday, I'm going to start the glazing process Friday afternoon at the high school, and I will be glazing your first project, like I said. And then the 2 projects following, you'll be glazing them on your own. So, using that information provided on the Google form, I will glaze your pinch pot in the color of your choice and fire it a second time. And then next Thursday, the 25th, and Friday, the 26th, you can come on campus and pick up those glaze fired pinch pots. Any questions about the glazing so far? Or the glaze choices, the 3 colors? Thank you, Melissa. So I have been going to Phoenix Ceramic Supply since I was at Cabrillo way back in the day. And that makes me feel old. I went to Cabrillo 13 years ago, and they had a amazing ceramics program, and they have amazing ceramic instructors. So if you're thinking about going to Cabrillo College, I highly recommend taking a ceramics course. Now, they have a partnership with Phoenix Ceramics, and through the high school at North County, we have been developing this relationship with Phoenix for 30 years. They've been supplying us with clay, tools, and dry ingredients to mix glazes, as well as small decorative glazes for sculptures like your monster or your animals. So, I want to give you a virtual tour of what the supply store looks like and what goes on the back end. So, you guys get to have these glazes ready for use and the clay fresh in the bag. But where does it come from, and how are these products manufactured, and where is it stored, and how do we get it? Let's take a look at Phoenix Ceramic Supply.
Hey kiddos, Miss I here, just getting to Phoenix Ceramic Supplies, downtown Santa Cruz. Let's go in and see what this place looks like. All ceramic with the opening.
So the whole entry, this is all clay that they made for the door frame. Back end with all the dry materials. Kevin has owned Phoenix Ceramic Supply since he was 20 years old.
And there are our underglaze choices for the projects.
So all the decorative glazes that we use that are not food safe, which is a different kind of glaze, comes in these little containers, and we use them in a small quantity to adorn any sculptures that we make that don't need to be heated up, right? We're not going to use them for functional forms. So there's Phoenix Ceramics. Oh, don't want to play that again.
Hey kiddos, Miss I.
All right. So here are a few more photos of the warehouse, and they have a ton of stuff. And this is where I get all the dry ingredients. So any food safe glazes that we have at North County, I make myself and mix the ingredients just like a recipe as if I was baking a cake, but also knowing that they're toxic, wearing a respirator to filter any chemicals so that I'm not inhaling those and worrying about getting silicosis, staying safe first. And then they have all these tools. For me, this is like Christmas every time I go in there. I love looking at all the different varieties and carving tools and how you can enhance pottery using different types of sponges and ribs and so forth. So, what is glaze anyway, and how does it melt, forming that glass-like surface? What's going on in the kiln? So, the ingredient that's melting when we're firing at a high temperature is silica. And it forms to a glass-like surface. But there's something that we need to consider when we're thinking and talking about glazes. How come it doesn't continue melting once it reaches a certain temperature? How does it stabilize? What stops it from dripping off your piece and forming a big puddle of glaze at the bottom? So the first thing I want you to know is that the silica is what's melting to form the glass-like surface. So let's first get that note down, and then we'll go on to discuss the specifics. So I'd like you to write down what is glaze, and then I want you to also record glaze contains silica, which melts to form glass. Once you have the title and that first arrow, go ahead and type glaze into the chat. Okay, let's take about a minute and a half roughly to get that note into the notebook and also confirming in the chat so that we can move at a steady pace today. So that silica melts. That is what is turning the glaze from matte to shiny to reveal that glassy exterior. And really cool things can happen when you start to layer glazes. If you take, like you see in this little bubble here, if you take white and you dip your piece in white and then you let it dry and then you dip blue on top of that, you're going to get these overlaps that create some psychedelic results where those two different colors meet. This is the fun about glazing, where you can really experiment and see how different colors work together to complement one another. Or maybe you might use two different colors, and when that silica melts, those two colors merge and it's not desirable. We've come up with colors that work well together in our studio, and I continue to experiment with that with the students to see varied results. Okay, moving on. So we were talking about controlling the melting point, right? Once that silica gets to a certain temperature, how come it doesn't just run right off our piece and form a big puddle at the bottom? Well, there's an ingredient that is so important in mixing glazes, and that ingredient is called flux. And flux controls the melting temperature. So at a certain point, when the kiln reaches approximately 1200 degrees, that flux kicks in and allows your silica to stabilize so that it doesn't run right off the piece and form a big puddle. Now, there's been times when I've forgotten to put the flux in the glaze recipe, and what a mess that was. Totally my fault. But it's like baking a cake without sugar. It's not gonna taste very good. So same thing with glazes. If you don't put the flux in there, that ingredient, you're gonna have a big mess and not something so desirable. So I want you to write down the definition of flux, and when you have that in the notebook, go ahead and type the word flux in the chat. I want you to think about an analogy. If I have a cupcake and I take that cupcake out of the oven, it's hot, and I want to put some vanilla frosting on top of the cupcake. Well, if the cupcake is super hot and I apply the frosting, right, that outside coating, it's going to run right off the piece. So there's a certain temperature that the cupcake would need to be at in order to allow the frosting to adhere and not completely melt right off the cupcake. Same thing with glazes. We want to control that melting point. Okay, waiting for 8 more people to confirm that they have the word flux in their notebook. So I'm looking for 8 more people to confirm in the chat. Now, I nerd out. I totally nerd out on this topic because when I was at San Jose State, one of the most well attended programs for ceramics in California, aside from Davis, UC Davis, I learned so much about glazes, how to make them, how to apply them, how to overlap and create all these cool patterns. So I love these types of topics, and I was never really one to be intrigued by chemistry, but I'm telling you, when it came to chemistry and ceramics, I just jumped on the train and I thought, tell me more. Whatever else I can absorb is going to help to benefit not only our program, but my personal practice. So, how do we ensure that we have nice, even coverage on our pieces? So, when we get those glazes and we're ready to apply them to our bisqueware, right? We fired the product once, it's come out of the kiln. Now it's time to glaze them. The first thing we need to do is make sure that our hands are clean. They are free from lotions or any oils. So if you just got done putting lotion on your hands, you're going to want to give your hands a wash before you start handling that bisqueware. If you do have any oils or lotions on your hands, you can have areas that resist the glaze, and that can look patchy and unfinished. So we try to be sure anytime we're glazing that we have clean hands. Okay, so the first thing that we do is we take a piece of sandpaper. So if you've ever taken my class before, I have you go outside and sand the product. And once you've sanded any burrs and boogers, I call them, those are rough areas. That could be from carving or maybe where you have a glob of slip that you accidentally got on your piece with your fingers. We sand those off and we make it smooth to the touch, even though we have maybe carved. And then after sanding, we have dust all over our piece. So we want to take a lightly damp sponge and dust off any silica dust so that the glaze is evenly distributed when it's time to add the glaze to our piece. I want you to write down the entire step on the slide. And once you have step one recorded in your notebook, go ahead and type the number one in the chat. So first, preparing the form, step one, sanding it with a little piece of sandpaper to remove any unwanted rough areas. And then following, taking a lightly damp sponge and dusting off any silica residue that may have been caused by sanding. Once you have step one, the entire slide recorded, go ahead and type step one in the chat. So there's just 5 short steps, you guys. Really important that we're consistent typing in the chat. I really want you guys to have some time at the end of class to get done our late assignments or get a head start on the homework. So keep up the good work and the strong communication. Okay, waiting for 9 more people to confirm in the chat for step one, prepare. Okay, moving on. If I go too fast today, if I'm not seeing people comment in the chat, you can always go back and make up some of the notes if I move too quickly. Step 2, we need to mix the glaze. So all the good stuff settles at the bottom when the glaze isn't being used. So we use a wooden stick or a wire whisk to vigorously stir the contents of the glaze and ensure that it's mixed and the molecules are evenly distributed. And after it sits for about 30 minutes, you would want to mix it again if you're making any fixes or touching up any areas. So, step 2, mix the glaze, mix it well. And then also, I want you to record the second bullet here to know that after it sits, it does settle. So, every time we go to use it, if it's been 30 minutes after we last mixed, we need to mix again. So, mixing the glaze is step 2. Once you have step 2, go ahead and write the number 2 in the chat. Okay, waiting for 5 more people to confirm in the chat for step 2, mix the glaze. Okay, oop, my computer's touchy sometimes. Step 3, we've sanded, we've dusted off any of the silica dust with a damp sponge. We mixed up the glaze, and now it is time to apply it. And we use tongs in the classroom to dip the bisqueware into the glaze bucket. And that really helps to avoid any fingerprints. If you notice that the tongs touch the piece in 4 different places, and it's literally almost the size of the tip of a tack. So you go back after you dip it and just add a little more glaze where the tong marks were. So, step 3, go ahead and record that in your notebook. Use tongs to dip the bisqueware into a bucket of glaze for an even application. Some people, they dip it with their hands, but I notice you get fingerprints that way and they're a little bit harder to cover up. And some people apply it with a pouring container. They pour glaze over the top of their piece. Other people use a paintbrush, which isn't super consistent unless you're doing detail work. So in this case, with the pinch pots, we would use tongs and dip it into a 5-gallon bucket. Once you have step 3 in your notebook, go ahead and type the number 3 in the chat. Okay, waiting for 7 more people to confirm step 3 in the chat. All right, let's take another 20 seconds to notate step 3. Apply the glaze with tongs. Also, notice how the artist is holding the pinch pot at an angle. So when they go to dip it, the glaze doesn't splatter all over the place. If they had held it upright and put the coil foot in first, it would make a splat and glaze would go all over the place. But if they hold it sideways, the liquid goes into the opening and then covers the exterior following. Okay, this is the most important part. And I'm going to be testing this information to see if you've retained it on quiz number 3, which is not until next week. But we need to really pay attention to step 4. And this is really important when you're glazing at home. I am going to be glazing your pinch pot. So I'm going to be wiping glaze off the bottom of approximately 90 pinch pots. But in any case, when you're glazing, you have to remove glaze from the bottom or wherever your piece touches a flat surface. So we do that with the damp sponge. Think about it. If you are firing a product with glaze on it and it heats up to a high temperature, that glass is going to fuse onto the kiln. Not only will your project get ruined and stick to the kiln shelf, I'll have to take a chisel and get it off of my kiln and also fix my kiln shelf, which is a pain in the butt. So, step 4, super important. Clean the bottom. Wipe any excess glaze from the bottom of your piece with a lightly damp sponge. Once you have step 4, type the number 4 in the chat. So, you can see the bottom image here where they have a super clean piece. No worries about it getting stuck to the shelf. And that is good news all around. With ceramics, we have to be really patient to even get a finished product. So if we've made it this far and we forgot to wipe the glaze off the bottom, it's such a bummer. So in the classroom, I actually have a shelf that's called the Fix It shelf. And if I find any pieces have not been cleaned on the bottom, I put them on the Fix It shelf and have you guys wipe the bottom. So just be mindful of that when you're glazing at home. Once you have step 4, and yes, Joseph, you do. You can go on over. Today we're almost done here, so give me like 5 more minutes as long as you get there before 3:30. So once you have step 4, type the number 4 in the chat. We got one more. You guys are doing really well. Okay, waiting for 7 more people to get step 4 in the notebook. Okay, this is what it looks like when we don't wipe the glaze off the bottom. You don't need to write this down, but it's important that you see what happens. So that silica starts to melt, and the flux, even though it controls the temperature, there's nothing that we can do to avoid it sticking if we leave glaze on the bottom. That glass will fuse to my kiln shelf, and then I'll take the chisel and I'll have to break off your piece. There's a 5% chance that I will get the piece off without breaking it. Really slim chances. And once I get it off, I've got glaze all over my kiln shelf, which means I got to go over to the wood shop, get an electric sander, sand it all down, and then I need to make what I call a kiln wash to repurpose the kiln shelf. And these shelves are about $25 a piece. Nothing in the ceramic world is cheap. So not only is it a bummer that your project's ruined, it's a lot of labor to repair these shelves and keep the kiln in working condition. All right, this is the last step I want you to write down the entire slide in your notebook. Step 5, make fixes. You want to check to see if there are any areas that you didn't cover with glaze. Maybe when you were wiping the bottom, you wiped off too much glaze on the side, or maybe the tong marks. You need to go back and take a paintbrush or your finger to add a little bit more of the glaze color that you used. Lastly, maybe you just put too much glaze or you handled it when the project wasn't completely dry. After we dip it in glaze, it takes about a minute for the glaze to dry. So you want to make sure that you make any fixes. Think about if your project is glazed in black and you miss areas, it's going to be really obvious if you're using a darker color glaze. So we scan the piece over, check it, and make sure that we have even coverage. The bottom's clean. If we need to make fixes, we can use a paintbrush, or sometimes I just dip my finger right into the glaze and touch that area where I don't see any glaze and cover the spot where needed. Once you have step 5, go ahead and type the number 5 in the chat and give your hand a little break from writing. So, Joseph, once you head over to the school, I want you to ask for Rosie when you get to campus security at the main gate. Rosie's going to come out and get it. She knows that you're coming, and she'll bring it over to the ceramics room. So, just be sure that you ask for her when you pull up, okay? All right, let's take another 45 seconds to get step 5 into the notebook. And then that is it for the notes today. Yep, and you just bring your pot, Joseph. That's correct. Make sure that it's on a flat surface. So you could even use a paper plate, that'd be fine. And one plastic bag over it. Okay, waiting for 8 more people to confirm in the chat. Four more people. Okay, so we are going to go over that information by watching a video with the clay lady. She's going to teach us glazing 101, but show it to us in a visual form. So we're going to look at her doing steps 1 through 5 that we just recorded in our notebook. The only difference is that for step 4, clean the bottom, instead of cleaning the bottom with just a sponge, the clay lady uses a ingredient called wax resist. And literally, it's wax that she paints on the bottom of her piece. So when she goes to dip it into the glaze bucket, the wax resists the glaze. And then she goes back and she wipes the bottom just a little bit. We don't use the wax in my class because I find that it's particularly messy. And if you get the wax where you don't want it to go, there's no going back. You can't actually get it off. So students tend to use the wax way too thick. And then all of a sudden, the piece looks unfinished when we glaze it. So we do it the old fashioned way. We glaze it and then we go back and wipe the bottom. So I just wanted to say that before playing the video because you might be like, what is wax? We didn't talk about wax. So I am going to skip over that part, but everything else we covered, she's going to discuss, and we're going to see it in sequence. Let's take a look.
Hi, I'm Danielle, the Clay Lady. Welcome to my studio on the Clay Ladies campus in Nashville, Tennessee. Today's lesson is going to be Glazing 101. Glaze is basically 5 different components. You have silica, which is the glassy part of the glaze. You have clay that makes it want to stick to a clay pot. You have a flux that makes those things like each other and hold together. There's a colorant, either a natural colorant like red iron oxide that's just found naturally in the ground, or a manufactured colorant, and water. When you glaze, what happens is your pot that's been bisque fired. The reason why it's called bisque fired because it's made your pot hard as a biscuit. Usually that temperature is measured in cone 06 to 04, basically around 1900 degrees. What happens at 1900 degrees is clay is made out of alumina and silica and a flux. And when it goes to that low temperature, the silica melts just enough to make the pot hard and make the particles stick together. But if you looked at a bisque pot on a microscopic level, it would look like a dry sponge. So when you dip a pot into glaze, the water soaks into the pot and the glaze forms a crust on the outside. This is important for you to understand because if you have your pot water soaked, let's say you glazed it, didn't turn out right, you rinsed it, you tried to glaze it, it's not going to work because your pot's already water soaked. If you double dip your glaze, dip it in one color, then dip it in another, the second coating is not going to dry as quickly because, again, your pot is already water soaked. For the same reason, this is why a pot that's already been glazed cannot be reglazed because there's nowhere for the water to go. It just runs off, pulling the glaze off with it. So we have waxed the bottom of our pot. The reason why we wax.
Okay, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit.
You'll get a nice even line. While we wait for the wax to dry, we're going to stir our glaze up. In my studio, we use dipping glazes. Glazes can go on brushing, dipping, pouring, spraying. We use the large 5-gallon buckets for all of our glazes. Opulence glaze also comes brushable, as do other manufacturers. There's some advantages to brushing. You don't have to buy a full 5-gallon bucket of glaze. It's good just for testing or if you have a small home studio. We've just started using brushable glazes in the studio for maybe some detail work or some smaller pieces. I'm going to stir this glaze up. As glaze settles, there's water on the top, the glaze falls to the bottom. We want to make sure that we get all the material up. A good vigorous stirring is important. Once we get that stirred up, it's time to dip the pot. I like to use dipping tongs just because it's manageable. It doesn't touch as much of your pot as if you use your hands. You can put your fingers on the wax part and your finger on the lip of the bowl, but most of my students use dipping tongs. We want to make sure that we get a good grip, but we, of course, don't want to push too hard. We don't want to pop through the pot. When you go into the glaze, I call it a 1, 2, 3 dive. 1, 2 in, 3 out. 1, 2 in, 3 out. Hold it upside down. It's good to have a sponge in hand so that you can get that extra glaze off the waxed part. We want to wait for it to dry. You can see how the water's soaking into the pot, leaving a crust of glaze on the outside. After it has a chance to dry, I could dip it in another color. I could keep it on the same dipping tongs and go to a different color. Or on this one, I think I might just want to do the rim. Now, wherever there's a drip, we can smear that down. Where the dipping tongs were, I'm going to use my fingernail and smooth that out just a little bit. We want to make sure that the glaze is all one level.
Okay, so I'm going to stop it there. Normally what I do is I take a paintbrush and I apply a little bit more glaze to ensure that I cover up the marks where the dipping tongs were. So that is glazing 101 in a nutshell. So now it's time, if you did turn in your pinch pot or you plan to turn it in this week and make an appointment, to choose the glaze colors. So again, option 1 was cobalt, option 2 is black, and option 3 is clear. And the reason why it looks white is because your clay body is naturally white. So it's just going to put a clear coating on the pot itself. So there is a Google form for this. I need you to fill out the Google form so that I have that information that you have chosen for your glaze selection. So let me show you where that is. We've got the glazing lecture from today, and then the glazing Google form is here. And I want you to, it looks like 2 people have turned that in already, to fill this out before Friday the 12th, or excuse me, Friday the 19th at 9 a.m. All right, so we have some synchronous work time right now. We have about 25 minutes to work. So first, I want you to complete any late work regarding the pinch pot. I want you to upload those 3 photos of your pinch pot so that I can grade that using the rubric. If there aren't any images, I don't have any way to properly evaluate your work. Next, I want you to upload your pinch pot lecture notes if you have not done that. If you've done everything on the list for item A, I want you to move on to item B. Study for and complete quiz 2. So you can use your lecture notes. It is open notes and it's 25 points. You can only take the quiz 1 time and it is due tonight by midnight. So if you don't get an opportunity to do it now, I want you to do it for homework. And then the last item on the list is the Google form. So right now in the chat, I want you to tell me, what are you going to work on? A, B, or C? Everybody choose an option. Are you working on A, B, or C? Let me know in the chat right now.